82 years ago, during a routine inspection at Pearl Harbor Naval Base, Brigadier General Marcus Wellington vanished without leaving a single trace. His disappearance plunged his family into tragedy and silent mourning, while the military community and fellow officers remained confused in the face of this mystery. Military archives suggested hypotheses, but no conclusion was reached. The case fell into official oblivion, but the family never lost hope, fighting for the truth to emerge. Before we continue, subscribe and activate the notification bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and proof. December 15th, 1943. The morning mist hung heavy over Pearl Harbor, almost 2 years after the devastating Japanese attack that had forever changed the course of American history. The naval base buzzed with constant activity, a symphony of reconstruction, preparation, and vigilant defense. Ships moved in and out of the harbor like mechanical giants, while soldiers and officers carried out their duties with the precision that war demands. Brigadier General Marcus Wellington, at 42 years old, was one of the most respected figures at the base, a man of unwavering principles, with steel-gray eyes that reflected both the wisdom of experience and the weight of command. He had survived the December 7th attack, helping to coordinate rescue operations while bombs fell around him. His bravery that day had earned him not only military decorations, but also the deep respect of every man and woman under his command. That Tuesday morning seemed like any other in Wellington's routine. He woke before dawn in his quarters, reviewed intelligence reports over black coffee, and prepared for what should have been a standard inspection of the harbor's defensive installations. His aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, had scheduled a series of visits to strategic points around the base, including the newly reinforced anti-aircraft positions and the submarine detection systems that had been implemented after the attack. Wellington's wife, Margaret, had written him a letter that arrived that very morning. In it, she spoke of their son, Thomas, now 16, who dreamed of following in his father's footsteps and serving his country. She mentioned their daughter Elizabeth, 14, who had started playing piano and sent her love across the Pacific. Margaret wrote about the small things that keep a family together during wartime: Sunday dinners, school events, and the constant hope that this war would end soon so they could be together again. At precisely 800 hours, General Wellington left his office to begin the inspection. Lieutenant Hayes accompanied him, carrying a leather briefcase with inspection reports and classified documents. They walked together toward the harbor, where a military jeep waited to transport them to the first checkpoint. Several witnesses saw them heading toward the eastern sector of the base, an area that housed some of the most sensitive defensive installations. The morning proceeded normally until 10:30 hours, when Lieutenant Hayes returned to headquarters alone, visibly shaken and confused. He reported that during the inspection of Installation Sector 7, General Wellington had received an urgent message and asked to be left alone for a few minutes to handle a classified matter of the highest priority. Hayes had waited in the jeep as instructed, but when Wellington failed to return after 30 minutes, the lieutenant went looking for him. What Hayes found defied all logic and military protocol. General Wellington's uniform cap lay on the ground near a concrete bunker, but there was no sign of the general himself. His briefcase was missing, along with all the classified documents it contained. Most disturbing of all, there were no footprints, no signs of struggle, no indication of what might have happened to one of Pearl Harbor's most important commanders. The immediate response was swift and comprehensive. Within minutes, the entire base was placed on high alert. Military police cordoned off the area while search teams combed every inch of the installation. Dogs were brought in to track any scent, boats swept the harbor waters, and aircraft conducted aerial reconnaissance of the surrounding area. Every soldier, sailor, and civilian worker on the base was questioned extensively, but as the hours turned into days and the days into weeks, no trace of General Marcus Wellington was found. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only questions, theories, and a family that would never be the same again. The disappearance of Brigadier General Marcus Wellington sent shockwaves through the highest levels of military command. Within hours of the initial report, investigators from Naval Intelligence, the FBI, and Army Criminal Investigation Division descended upon Pearl Harbor like a storm. This was not just the disappearance of any officer. This was a general who possessed knowledge of some of America's most sensitive wartime secrets, vanishing in the middle of the Pacific theater of operations. Commander James Morrison, a seasoned naval intelligence officer with a reputation for solving impossible cases, was assigned to lead the investigation. Morrison had spent years in counterintelligence work, hunting German and Japanese spies throughout the Pacific. His sharp analytical mind and methodical approach had earned him respect among his peers, but the Wellington case would prove to be unlike anything he had encountered before. The crime scene, if it could be called that, offered more questions than answers. Installation Sector 7 was a restricted area, housing advanced radar equipment and classified communication systems. Access required special clearance, and every entry and exit was supposed to be logged. Yet the security logs showed only Wellington and Hayes entering the area that morning, with no record of anyone else coming or going. Morrison's team meticulously examined every inch of the bunker where Wellington's cap was found. The concrete structure, built hurriedly after the Pearl Harbor attack, contained sophisticated radio equipment used for monitoring Japanese naval communications. The bunker had only one entrance, which faced the area where Hayes had waited with the jeep. There were no other exits, no windows, no ventilation shafts large enough for a person to crawl through. The mystery deepened when investigators realized that some of the radio equipment showed signs of recent use, despite the fact that the bunker was not scheduled for any communications operations that day. Frequency settings had been altered, and message logs contained entries that no one could explain. Most disturbing of all, the classified documents from Wellington's briefcase were nowhere to be found, raising the terrifying possibility that sensitive military intelligence had fallen into enemy hands. Lieutenant Hayes underwent intensive questioning for days. His story never wavered. The general had received a message, asked for privacy, and simply never returned. But investigators pressed him on every detail. What kind of message? Who delivered it? Hayes insisted he never saw a messenger, never heard a radio transmission, never witnessed anything unusual until Wellington failed to return. The investigation expanded to examine Wellington's personal life and military record with microscopic detail. His correspondence with his wife Margaret was scrutinized for any signs of distress, coded messages, or unusual behavior. His financial records were examined for any evidence of bribery or blackmail. His relationships with fellow officers, subordinates, and civilian personnel were all investigated for any hint of conflict or conspiracy. What emerged was the portrait of an exemplary officer with an unblemished record. Wellington had no debts, no known enemies, no personal problems that might motivate him to disappear voluntarily. His devotion to his family was evident in every letter he wrote home. His loyalty to his country had been proven time and again, most notably during the Pearl Harbor attack, when he had risked his own life to save others. The possibility of enemy action was thoroughly investigated. Japanese submarines were known to operate in Hawaiian waters, and the possibility of a covert landing or kidnapping operation was considered. But intelligence reports showed no unusual enemy activity in the area, and a kidnapping seemed impossible given the high security and constant surveillance at Pearl Harbor. As weeks turned into months, the investigation began to consume enormous resources while producing few results. Search teams had scoured thousands of square miles of ocean, interviewed hundreds of witnesses, and followed up on dozens of leads. Every theory was explored: voluntary disappearance, kidnapping, murder, espionage, accident, suicide. Yet none provided a satisfactory explanation for how a general could vanish without a trace from one of America's most secure military installations. The pressure from Washington grew intense. High-ranking officials demanded answers, wanting to know if military security had been compromised, if enemy agents were operating within American bases, if other officers might be at risk. But Commander Morrison and his team had no answers to give, only more questions that seemed to multiply with each passing day. By the spring of 1944, the official investigation was quietly scaled back. The war was demanding resources, and the search for one missing general, however important, could not continue indefinitely without results. A classified report was filed, concluding that General Wellington's fate remained undetermined pending further evidence. The case was marked as open but inactive, a bureaucratic designation that essentially meant it had been forgotten by everyone except those who had loved Marcus Wellington. While military investigators gradually abandoned their search, the Wellington family began their own quiet battle against silence and uncertainty. Margaret Wellington, a woman of remarkable strength who had married her high school sweetheart and followed him through a distinguished military career, now faced the most difficult challenge of her life: explaining to her children why their father would never come home. The official notification had been brief and clinical. Missing in action, circumstances unknown. No body, no confirmation of death, no closure of any kind. Just an empty space where Marcus Wellington used to be, and a military bureaucracy that seemed increasingly uncomfortable discussing the matter as months passed without resolution. Margaret's world had been turned upside down overnight. One day she was the wife of a respected general, secure in her role as a military spouse, planning for their reunion after the war. The next day she was a woman in limbo, neither widow nor wife, suspended between hope and despair. The military provided a modest support allowance, but it came with the understanding that it could be discontinued at any time if Marcus were declared dead. 16-year-old Thomas Wellington struggled with rage and confusion that he was too young to fully understand. His father had been his hero, the man he wanted to emulate, the standard by which he measured himself. Now that hero had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and a son who felt abandoned, despite knowing logically that his father would never leave voluntarily. Thomas threw himself into physical training, preparing for the day when he would be old enough to enlist and perhaps find answers that had eluded everyone else. 14-year-old Elizabeth reacted differently, retreating into herself and finding solace in music. She spent hours at the piano, playing melancholy pieces that seemed to express the grief her family couldn't put into words. Her teachers reported that she had become withdrawn and distracted, a bright child suddenly struggling with concentration and social interaction. The trauma of losing her father without understanding why had created wounds that would take years to heal. Margaret began a correspondence campaign that would last for decades. She wrote letters to congressmen, senators, military officials, and anyone else who might have influence or information. Her letters were always polite, always respectful, but increasingly desperate as years passed without answers. She requested meetings with investigators, asked for access to classified files, and pleaded for any information about her husband's fate. The responses were uniformly sympathetic and uniformly unhelpful. Officials expressed their regret, assured her that everything possible had been done, and suggested that she should begin to accept that her husband was probably dead. But Margaret refused to accept what others saw as inevitable. Without proof, without a body, without any real explanation of what had happened, she maintained that Marcus was alive somewhere, perhaps suffering from amnesia, perhaps being held prisoner, perhaps unable to contact his family for reasons beyond his control. This hope, which others viewed as denial, sustained Margaret through the darkest years of her life. She kept Marcus's study exactly as he had left it, his books and papers undisturbed, his photograph on the mantel surrounded by fresh flowers that she replaced weekly. She continued to wear her wedding ring and refused several marriage proposals from well-meaning friends who thought it was time for her to move on. The community's support gradually faded as the war ended, and people focused on rebuilding their own lives. Neighbors who had initially offered comfort and assistance began to view Margaret's continuing search as an unhealthy obsession. Friends gently suggested that she needed to accept reality and think about her children's future. Even family members began to hint that her refusal to declare Marcus dead was preventing the family from healing and moving forward. But Margaret had allies in her quest for truth. A small group of military wives who had lost their own husbands in mysterious circumstances formed an informal support network. They shared information, compared experiences, and supported each other's efforts to find answers that the military establishment seemed reluctant to provide. These women understood that missing in action was not the same as killed in action, and they refused to let their husbands be forgotten or dismissed. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are listening to this story. We are interested to know to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. Among Margaret's most dedicated supporters was Dr. Helen Crawford, a civilian researcher who had become fascinated by unexplained military disappearances. Dr. Crawford believed that patterns existed in these cases, that there might be connections between different disappearances that official investigators had missed or ignored. She began collecting files, interviewing families, and building a database of information that would eventually span decades. As the official investigation stalled and then effectively ended, unofficial theories about General Wellington's disappearance began to proliferate throughout Pearl Harbor and beyond. In the close-knit military community, where gossip traveled faster than official communications, speculation about what had happened to the respected general became a favorite topic of conversation in mess halls, barracks, and officers' clubs. The most widely accepted theory was that Wellington had been the victim of enemy action. Despite the lack of evidence for Japanese infiltration, many believed that enemy agents had somehow managed to kidnap or kill the general without leaving traces. This theory gained credibility from the fact that Wellington had access to highly classified information about American defensive capabilities and strategic plans. Some suggested that his disappearance was so perfectly executed that it could only have been the work of professional spies with inside knowledge of base security procedures. A more disturbing theory suggested that Wellington's disappearance was the result of internal conspiracy. According to this version, which was whispered in dark corners but never openly discussed, someone within the American military hierarchy had arranged for Wellington to be eliminated. Proponents of this theory pointed to the general's reputation for moral integrity and his occasional criticism of certain strategic decisions. They suggested that he had discovered corruption or incompetence in the command structure and had been silenced before he could expose it. Commander Morrison, despite officially closing his investigation, privately harbored his own theories about what might have happened. In confidential reports that would remain classified for decades, Morrison wrote about inconsistencies in witness statements, unexplained gaps in security protocols, and suspicious behaviors among certain base personnel. He never publicly voiced his suspicions, but his private files suggested that he believed Wellington's disappearance involved more than simple enemy action or accidental death. The theory that Wellington had suffered some kind of accident gained support from those who preferred rational explanations over conspiracy theories. According to this version, the general had somehow fallen into the harbor waters, perhaps suffering a heart attack or stroke that incapacitated him before he could call for help. Supporters of this theory pointed out that the currents around Pearl Harbor were strong and unpredictable, capable of carrying a body far out to sea within hours. They argued that the missing briefcase and documents had simply been lost along with Wellington's body. But the accident theory failed to explain several puzzling aspects of the case. Wellington was known to be in excellent physical condition, with no history of heart problems or other health issues that might cause sudden incapacitation. Moreover, the location where his cap was found was nowhere near the harbor's edge, making it difficult to explain how he could have accidentally fallen into the water. A few investigators quietly considered the possibility that Wellington had arranged his own disappearance. This theory suggested that the general, burdened by war stress or personal problems that he had kept hidden, had decided to start a new life under a different identity. Proponents pointed to the complete absence of physical evidence as proof that the disappearance had been carefully planned and executed by someone with intimate knowledge of military security procedures. However, those who knew Wellington personally rejected this theory completely. His devotion to his family was legendary, and his sense of duty and honor made it inconceivable that he would abandon his responsibilities. Margaret Wellington herself dismissed this possibility with absolute certainty, stating that her husband would never voluntarily leave his family or desert his post, regardless of any personal difficulties he might have been experiencing. Among the civilian population of Hawaii, more exotic theories emerged. Some claimed that Wellington had been abducted by extraterrestrial beings, pointing to several reported UFO sightings in the Hawaiian Islands during 1943. Others suggested that he had been kidnapped by local criminals seeking ransom, though no demands were ever received and organized crime was relatively minimal in wartime Hawaii. The intelligence community developed its own classified theories about Wellington's fate. Secret reports, not declassified until decades later, revealed that some analysts suspected Wellington had been recruited as a double agent by enemy forces, either voluntarily or through coercion. These reports suggested that his disappearance might have been a carefully orchestrated defection designed to provide the Japanese with access to American military secrets. However, no evidence was ever found to support the defection theory. Wellington's loyalty had been thoroughly investigated and confirmed, and intelligence intercepts from Japanese sources never revealed any indication that they had gained access to American secrets through a high-level defector. The theory gradually lost credibility as the war progressed without any apparent intelligence breaches. that could be traced to Wellington's disappearance. As years passed and the case grew colder, the theories became increasingly elaborate and disconnected from available evidence. Some suggested that Wellington had been recruited by a secret government agency for a covert mission so classified that even his disappearance had to be covered up. Others proposed that he had been assassinated by foreign agents and his body disposed of in ways that would never be discovered. The proliferation of theories, each more speculative than the last, reflected the deep human need to find explanations for inexplicable events. Wellington's disappearance had created a vacuum of understanding that people filled with their own fears, prejudices, and imaginative constructions. But none of these theories, no matter how elaborate or emotionally satisfying, could provide the one thing that Wellington's family desperately needed: the truth about what had happened to Marcus Wellington on that December morning in 1943. The years following World War II brought profound changes to America, but for the Wellington family, time seemed frozen in December 1943. While the nation celebrated victory and embraced peacetime prosperity, Margaret Wellington continued her solitary vigil, maintaining hope that her husband would somehow return, or that answers about his fate would finally emerge from the shadows of military bureaucracy. The 1950s arrived with promises of normalcy and suburban tranquility, but the Wellington household remained haunted by absence. Thomas had enlisted in the army immediately upon turning 18, driven by a complex mixture of patriotism and personal mission. He served with distinction in Korea, always hoping that military service might provide him with access to information about his father's disappearance. But the Korean War came and went without revealing any new insights into the mystery that had consumed his family. Elizabeth, now a young woman, had developed into a talented pianist whose melancholy performances reflected years of unresolved grief. She married a kind man named Robert Hayes, not the lieutenant who had been with her father, but a civilian with the same name who understood her need to honor her missing father's memory. Elizabeth struggled with the decision to take her husband's name, eventually choosing to hyphenate it as Wellington Hayes, maintaining her connection to the father she barely remembered, but whose absence had shaped her entire life. Margaret's correspondence campaign continued throughout the decades, adapting to changes in military leadership and political administration. She wrote to every Secretary of Defense, every chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, every president who took office during her lifetime. Her letters evolved over time, becoming more sophisticated in their legal arguments and more desperate in their emotional appeals. She learned military terminology, studied classification procedures, and developed relationships with sympathetic congressional staff members who tried to help within the constraints of national security requirements. The responses to Margaret's letters followed predictable patterns. New officials would express sympathy and promise to review the case, often assigning junior staff members to conduct perfunctory examinations of old files. These reviews invariably concluded that everything possible had been done, that no new evidence existed, and that the case should remain closed. The officials would then move on to other responsibilities, leaving Margaret to begin the process again with their successors. During the 1960s, as America grappled with questions about government transparency and military accountability, Margaret found new allies among journalists and civil rights activists who supported her quest for information. The Freedom of Information Act, passed in 1966, provided new legal tools for accessing government documents, but military files related to Wellington's disappearance remained classified under national security exemptions. Margaret hired lawyers when she could afford them, filed formal petitions when legal remedies were available, and organized publicity campaigns when other approaches failed. She appeared on television talk shows, gave interviews to newspaper reporters, and spoke at conferences about military families' rights to information. Her case became a symbol for other families seeking answers about loved ones who had disappeared during military service. But the military establishment proved remarkably resistant to outside pressure. Officials cited ongoing security concerns, protection of intelligence sources and methods, and the need to maintain operational secrecy even decades after the events in question. They argued that releasing information about Wellington's disappearance might compromise current operations or reveal capabilities that enemies could exploit. Thomas, now a decorated veteran and successful businessman, used his own military contacts to pursue information about his father. He cultivated relationships with intelligence officers, Pentagon officials, and defense contractors who might have access to classified materials. His approach was more subtle than his mother's direct confrontational style, but it proved equally unsuccessful in penetrating the wall of official silence. The 1970s brought new hope when congressional investigations into intelligence agencies revealed decades of secret operations and cover-ups. Margaret testified before congressional committees about her father's case, hoping that the new climate of government accountability would force disclosure of information about military disappearances. But while these investigations exposed many previously hidden activities, they shed no light on what had happened to Marcus Wellington in 1943. Elizabeth, meanwhile, had become a mother herself, raising children who knew their grandfather only through photographs and stories. She struggled to explain to her own children why their grandmother spent so much time and energy pursuing a mystery that seemed increasingly unlikely to be solved. The younger generation, born into prosperity and stability, found it difficult to understand the psychological wounds that wartime losses had inflicted on their elders. Dr. Helen Crawford, Margaret's longtime ally in the search for truth, continued her research into military disappearances throughout these decades. Her files had grown into a comprehensive database containing hundreds of cases from World War II through Vietnam. She identified patterns and anomalies that suggested systematic problems with military record-keeping and family notification procedures, but she never found the smoking gun that would force official acknowledgement of these issues. As Margaret entered her 70s, friends and family members gently suggested that it might be time to abandon her quest. Thomas and Elizabeth, both now middle-aged with families and responsibilities of their own, worried about their mother's health and psychological well-being. They feared that her decades-long search had become an obsession that prevented her from enjoying the time she had left. But Margaret refused to consider giving up. She had devoted her entire adult life to finding the truth about Marcus Wellington's disappearance, and she could not accept that this effort had been wasted. More importantly, she remained convinced that somewhere in government files lay the answers that would finally explain what had happened to her husband. She believed that persistence would eventually overcome bureaucratic resistance, that truth would ultimately triumph over secrecy. The 1980s brought a new generation of Wellington descendants who inherited both the family's unresolved grief and their grandmother's unwavering determination to find answers. Thomas's son Marcus, named for the grandfather he never knew, grew up hearing stories about the mysterious general whose disappearance had shaped 3 generations of family history. Unlike his elders, who approached the mystery with emotional intensity born of personal loss, young Marcus brought the analytical skills of his generation to bear on the decades-old puzzle. Marcus Wellington Jr., armed with a computer science degree and access to emerging digital technologies, began digitizing his grandmother's extensive correspondence files. What had been boxes of letters, documents, and photographs became searchable databases that could reveal patterns and connections previously hidden in the sheer volume of accumulated material. This systematic approach uncovered discrepancies in official accounts, inconsistencies in witness statements, and gaps in documentation that had been overlooked during the original investigation. Margaret, now in her 80s but still mentally sharp, watched with fascination as her grandson applied modern methods to her life's work. The computer analysis revealed that several key documents from the original investigation had been removed from official files at various times over the decades, suggesting ongoing efforts to control information about the case. More intriguingly, the analysis showed connections between Wellington's disappearance and several other mysterious incidents that had occurred at Pearl Harbor during the same time period. Elizabeth's daughter Sarah, a journalism student at Columbia University, chose her grandfather's case as the subject of her senior thesis project. Her academic research brought fresh perspectives and rigorous methodology to questions that had been pursued primarily through emotional appeals and informal investigation. Sarah obtained access to university archives, military history collections, and oral history projects that contained information not available through official channels. Sarah's research uncovered a network of civilian researchers, military historians, and former intelligence officers who had been quietly investigating military disappearances for decades. This informal community shared information, compared notes, and supported each other's research efforts while maintaining discretion about their activities. Through these connections, Sarah learned about similar cases that had occurred at other military installations during World War II, suggesting that Wellington's disappearance might be part of a larger pattern. The most significant breakthrough came when Sarah discovered that several classified documents related to Pearl Harbor operations had been accidentally released through bureaucratic errors during the 1970s. These documents, which had been quickly recalled and reclassified, contained references to Special Operation Nightfall and Project Clearwater, code names that appeared nowhere in official histories of Pearl Harbor operations. If this case has already captured your attention, leave a like. This helps General Wellington's story reach more people. Further investigation revealed that these operations had involved highly classified communications interception and counterintelligence activities conducted from Installation Sector 7, the exact location where Wellington had disappeared. The documents suggested that the bunker where Wellington's cap was found had been used for more than routine radar operations, serving as a hub for sophisticated intelligence-gathering activities that involved intercepting and decoding enemy communications. Marcus Jr.'s computer analysis revealed additional disturbing patterns. Several other military personnel who had been associated with Installation Sector 7 had also disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances during 1943 and 1944. While each individual case had been investigated and closed as unresolved, no one had previously recognized the connection between these incidents and their relationship to the classified intelligence operations. The family's investigation received unexpected support from an aging former intelligence officer named Colonel William Morrison, the son of Commander James Morrison, who had led the original investigation into Wellington's disappearance. Colonel Morrison had inherited his father's private files, including materials that had never been included in official reports. These files contained his father's personal theories about what had happened to Wellington, and his suspicions about cover-up activities within the military hierarchy. According to Morrison's private notes, Commander Morrison had believed that Wellington had discovered evidence of a security breach within the Pearl Harbor intelligence operations. The note suggested that Wellington had arranged a secret meeting to confront someone about this breach, and that this confrontation had led to his disappearance. Morrison had apparently suspected specific individuals within the Pearl Harbor command structure, but had been unable to prove his theories before the investigation was officially terminated. The younger Morrison also revealed that his father had been pressured by superior officers to conclude the investigation quickly and quietly, despite his belief that important leads had not been fully explored. Commander Morrison had apparently been told that national security considerations required limiting the scope of the investigation and preventing any publicity that might compromise ongoing intelligence operations. These revelations provided the Wellington family with their first concrete evidence that official accounts of the investigation had been incomplete and possibly deliberately misleading. The discovery that military officials had actively suppressed information and limited investigative activities vindicated Margaret's decades-long conviction that the truth about her husband's disappearance had been hidden by government secrecy. But even these breakthroughs failed to answer the fundamental question of what had actually happened to Marcus Wellington on December 15, 1943. The new information provided context and suggested motives for cover-up activities, but the fate of the general himself remained as mysterious as ever. The family had gained insight into why they had been unable to find answers for so many decades, but they were still no closer to learning whether Wellington was alive or dead, or what had become of him after he entered that bunker for the last time. The arrival of the Internet age in the 1990s revolutionized the Wellington family's search for answers about their missing patriarch. What had been a lonely quest pursued through letters and phone calls suddenly became part of a global network of researchers, historians, and families seeking information about disappeared military personnel. Online databases, digitized military records, and email communications opened new avenues for investigation that previous generations could never have imagined. Marcus Wellington Jr. created one of the first websites dedicated to World War II military disappearances, with his grandfather's case serving as the centerpiece of a comprehensive database that eventually included hundreds of similar incidents. The website attracted attention from researchers around the world, including historians in Japan, who provided access to previously unavailable Japanese military archives that had been translated and digitized by academic institutions. The Japanese archives proved to be a treasure trove of information about wartime intelligence operations in the Pacific. Documents revealed extensive Japanese efforts to infiltrate American military installations, recruit intelligence assets, and conduct sabotage operations throughout the Hawaiian Islands. More significantly, the archives contained references to American military personnel who had been targeted for elimination or recruitment by Japanese intelligence services. Among these documents was a declassified report from Japanese naval intelligence that mentioned a high-value American target at Pearl Harbor who possessed critical information about enemy defensive capabilities and communication protocols. The report, dated December 1943, described an operation to neutralize or acquire this target through local assets and sympathetic contacts. While the report did not mention Wellington by name, the timing and description matched his profile exactly. Sarah Wellington Hayes, now a professional journalist with The Washington Post, used her press credentials to gain access to newly declassified American intelligence files that had been released following the end of the Cold War. These files revealed the existence of a previously unknown counterintelligence operation called Project Clearwater that had been conducted at Pearl Harbor during 1943 to identify and eliminate Japanese intelligence networks operating within American military installations. According to the declassified documents, Project Clearwater had identified several American military personnel who were suspected of collaborating with Japanese intelligence services. The operation involved elaborate surveillance, communication interception, and what were euphemistically described as neutralization activities designed to protect American security interests. General Wellington's name appeared in these files as both an investigator and a potential target of the Japanese networks. The documents revealed that Wellington had been conducting his own informal investigation into security breaches at Pearl Harbor, having noticed irregularities in communication protocols and suspicious activities among certain personnel. His investigation had apparently identified patterns that suggested Japanese agents were operating within the base, possibly including American military personnel who had been recruited or coerced into collaboration. More disturbing still, the files suggested that some American intelligence officials had suspected Wellington himself of being a security risk. His access to classified information, combined with his independent investigation activities, had apparently raised concerns among counterintelligence officers who worried that his inquiries might compromise ongoing operations or reveal sources and methods that needed to be protected. The picture that emerged from these documents was of a complex web of suspicion, surveillance, and conflicting loyalties within the Pearl Harbor intelligence community. Wellington appeared to have been caught in the middle of this web, trusted by some colleagues and suspected by others, investigating security breaches while being investigated himself. Elizabeth, now in her 70s but still actively involved in the family's search for truth, struggled to reconcile these revelations with her memories of her father as a patriotic officer devoted to American victory in the war. The suggestion that her father might have been suspected of disloyalty was particularly painful, given his family's decades of effort to honor his memory and maintain faith in his integrity. But Marcus Jr.'s analysis of the declassified documents revealed inconsistencies and contradictions that suggested the suspicions against Wellington had been based on incomplete information and possibly deliberate misinformation. The chronology of events indicated that Wellington had been investigating the very security breaches that led to suspicions against him, suggesting that he might have been framed by the actual security risks he was trying to identify. The most significant breakthrough came when Sarah discovered references to Wellington in the personal papers of a former Japanese intelligence officer who had defected to American forces late in the war. These papers, archived at a university research center, contained detailed descriptions of Japanese intelligence operations in Hawaii, including specific plans to eliminate or recruit key American military personnel. According to the defector's account, Wellington had been identified as a high-priority target because of his knowledge of American communication systems and his role in coordinating defensive operations. The Japanese had apparently planned to approach Wellington through intermediaries, offering bribes or making threats to secure his cooperation, When these approaches failed, the plan had shifted to elimination, with the goal of making Wellington's death appear accidental or the result of enemy action. The defectors' papers described a meeting that had been arranged between Wellington and someone he believed to be a trusted colleague, but who was actually working as a Japanese agent. This meeting was supposed to take place at Installation Sector 7 on December 15, 1943, the exact date and location of Wellington's disappearance. For the first time in 50 years, the Wellington family had a plausible explanation for what had happened to their patriarch. But even this revelation raised new questions. If Wellington had been murdered by enemy agents, what had happened to his body? Who was the American collaborator who had lured him to the fatal meeting? Why had American intelligence agencies never revealed this information to Wellington's family, even after the war ended and national security concerns should have been resolved? The answers to these questions would remain elusive for another 3 decades, buried in files that remained classified, and memories that had been deliberately obscured by the passage of time and the deaths of those who possessed first-hand knowledge of the events. By 2020, advanced underwater archaeology and marine detection technologies had reached levels that would have seemed like science fiction to investigators in 1943. The Wellington family, now represented by a 4th generation of descendants, partnered with the University of Hawaii's Marine Archaeology program to conduct systematic searches of Pearl Harbor waters using sonar mapping, underwater robotics, and artificial intelligence analysis of seafloor formations. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a marine archaeologist specializing in World War II underwater sites, had become fascinated by the Wellington case through Sarah's journalistic coverage of military disappearances. Dr. Martinez believed that previous searches had been limited by primitive technology and incomplete understanding of Pearl Harbor's underwater geography, which had been dramatically altered by wartime construction projects and post-war harbor modifications. The new search effort utilized autonomous underwater vehicles, equipped with high-resolution sonar and photographic equipment capable of detecting anomalies in seafloor sediment that might indicate buried objects or human remains. These vehicles could operate for extended periods without human supervision, methodically scanning areas that had been inaccessible to earlier search efforts. Marcus Wellington III, great-grandson of the missing general, had become a software engineer specializing in artificial intelligence applications. He developed pattern recognition algorithms specifically designed to identify potential archaeological sites based on subtle variations in seafloor composition, debris patterns, and geological formations. His programs could process vast amounts of sonar data and flag locations that warranted closer investigation by human researchers. The search effort was complicated by decades of harbor development, environmental changes, and the accumulation of modern debris that obscured older materials. Pearl Harbor had been continuously modified since 1943, with new piers, dredging operations, and construction projects that had altered the underwater landscape. Additionally, the harbor served as a final resting place for numerous aircraft, vehicles, and equipment that had been lost or discarded over 8 decades of military operations. During the summer of 2020, the underwater vehicles detected an anomaly, approximately 2 miles offshore from Installation Sector 7, in an area that had been designated as a military dumping ground during the 1940s. The sonar signatures suggested a large metallic object buried beneath several feet of sediment, in a location that marine archaeologists determined would have been accessible by small boats during the wartime period. Initial investigation revealed the remains of what appeared to be a military landing craft of the type used for covert operations during World War II. The vessel showed evidence of deliberate scuttling, with holes punched through the hull and the engine compartment flooded with seawater. More intriguingly, the boat contained personal items and equipment that appeared to date from the 1940s, including military-issue gear and documents that had been preserved in waterproof containers. Among the recovered materials were fragments of maps showing Pearl Harbor installations, communication equipment of the type used by intelligence services, and personal items including a leather briefcase that bore the initials MW. The briefcase contained waterlogged documents that proved difficult to read, but laboratory analysis revealed traces of text that matched reports known to have been in General Wellington's possession on the day of his disappearance. The discovery of the scuttled boat and Wellington's briefcase provided the first physical evidence of what had happened on December 15, 1943. The location of the boat, combined with the condition of the materials found aboard, suggested that Wellington had indeed been lured to a meeting that resulted in his death. The presence of his briefcase indicated that the classified documents he carried had been recovered by enemy agents before the boat was scuttled to conceal evidence of the operation. But the boat itself raised new questions about the scope and sophistication of the Japanese intelligence operation that had targeted Wellington. The vessel was larger and better equipped than would have been necessary for a simple assassination, suggesting that the original plan might have been to capture Wellington alive and transport him to a location where he could be interrogated about American military secrets. Advanced forensic techniques were applied to analyze the boat and its contents for any traces of human remains or DNA evidence that might confirm Wellington's presence aboard the vessel. While decades of saltwater immersion had degraded most organic materials, laboratory analysis detected trace amounts of human blood on metal surfaces within the boat's cabin. DNA testing was inconclusive due to contamination and degradation, but the blood type matched Wellington's military medical records. The discovery also revealed evidence of careful planning and preparation for the operation that claimed Wellington's life. The boat contained specialized equipment for communication interception, document photography, and prisoner restraint that indicated the Japanese agents had been prepared for multiple contingencies. Maps found aboard the vessel showed detailed knowledge of Pearl Harbor security procedures, patrol schedules, and classified installation locations that could only have been obtained through inside sources. This evidence supported the theory that Wellington had been betrayed by someone within the American military hierarchy who possessed intimate knowledge of his activities and security clearances. The precision and timing of the operation suggested that the Japanese agents had been provided with specific information about Wellington's schedule, his planned inspection route, and the security arrangements for installation Sector 7. Further analysis of the boat revealed that it had been modified for covert operations, with hidden compartments, sound-dampening materials, and specialized navigation equipment that would have allowed it to operate undetected in Hawaiian waters. The sophistication of these modifications indicated that the vessel had been used for multiple intelligence operations, not just the single mission that resulted in Wellington's disappearance. The University of Hawaii research team expanded their search area based on the location of the scuttled boat, hoping to find additional evidence about the fate of General Wellington's remains. If the original plan had been to capture him alive, there might be other locations where evidence of his final fate could be recovered. These expanded searches would continue for several more years, using increasingly sophisticated technology and analytical techniques. But the discovery of the boat and briefcase had already provided Wellington's family with more answers than they had obtained during 7 decades of previous investigation. For the first time, they had physical proof of what had happened to their patriarch, even if many questions about the details and aftermath of his disappearance remained unanswered. In early 2025, a routine environmental survey of Pearl Harbor's seafloor, conducted by the Navy's Marine Environmental Assessment Division, detected an unusual sonar signature in a previously unexplored section of the harbor. The signature appeared to be a small cave or cavern system that had been hidden beneath sediment layers for decades. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, still leading the Wellington family's archaeological efforts, obtained permission to investigate this anomaly as part of her ongoing research into World War II underwater sites. The cave system, accessible only by advanced diving equipment and underwater robotics, proved to contain a preserved environment that had been sealed from external contamination for over 80 years. The cavern had apparently been used as a hiding place or temporary storage facility during the war, containing equipment, documents, and personal effects that had been remarkably well preserved by the stable underwater environment. Among the materials recovered from the cave were the remains of what appeared to be a Japanese intelligence operative's complete equipment kit, including communication devices, weapons, false identification documents, and detailed maps of Pearl Harbor installations. More significantly, the cave contained extensive documentation of intelligence operations conducted against American military personnel between 1942 and 1945, including specific plans for the operation that targeted General Wellington. The recovered documents, written in a mixture of Japanese and English, provided a complete account of the intelligence operation that had resulted in Wellington's disappearance. According to these records, Wellington had been identified as a high-priority target, not only because of his access to classified information, but because his independent investigation into security breaches had threatened to expose a network of Japanese agents operating throughout the Pacific Theater. The operation against Wellington had been planned and executed by a team of 3 Japanese intelligence officers, working in coordination with at least 2 American military personnel who had been recruited as collaborators. The plan had originally called for Wellington's capture and removal to a secure location where he could be interrogated about American military capabilities and strategic plans. But Wellington had apparently realized during the meeting that he was being betrayed and had attempted to escape before he could be captured. The documents described a struggle during which Wellington was killed, either accidentally or deliberately, by one of the conspirators. His body had been weighted and disposed of in deep water far from Pearl Harbor, in an area that had never been searched, despite decades of investigation. The recovered records also revealed the identity of Wellington's betrayer, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hayes, a staff officer who had worked closely with Wellington on intelligence matters and who had gained his trust through months of careful cultivation. Hayes had been recruited by Japanese intelligence through a combination of bribery and blackmail, exploiting financial difficulties and personal indiscretions that made him vulnerable to coercion. After Wellington's murder, Hayes had continued his intelligence activities for several more months before being killed in what appeared to be a training accident, but was actually an assassination carried out by his Japanese handlers to prevent his capture and interrogation by American counterintelligence services. The Japanese documents revealed that Hayes had become increasingly unstable after Wellington's death, showing signs of guilt and psychological distress that made him a security risk. The cave also contained Wellington's personal effects that had been taken from him during the fatal meeting, including his watch, wallet, military identification, and wedding ring. These items had been kept as trophies by the Japanese operatives, along with photographs documenting the operation and its aftermath. Most heartbreakingly, the cache included letters that Wellington had been carrying from his wife and children, letters that he would never have the chance to read. DNA analysis of blood traces found on Wellington's personal effects confirmed his identity and provided the Wellington family with definitive proof of their patriarch's fate. After 82 years of uncertainty, they finally had answers about what had happened on December 15, 1943, and why no trace of General Wellington had been found despite extensive searches. The discovery also solved several other mysteries that had puzzled investigators for decades. The unexplained alterations to radio equipment in the bunker, where Wellington's cap was found, had been made by Japanese agents testing communication frequencies used by American intelligence services. The missing classified documents from Wellington's briefcase had been photographed and transmitted to Japanese intelligence before being destroyed to conceal evidence of the operation. Margaret Wellington had passed away in 1995, having devoted 52 years of her life to searching for the truth about her husband's disappearance. She had maintained her faith that answers would eventually be found and had established a trust fund to continue the investigation after her death. Her descendants took comfort in knowing that her lifelong quest had ultimately been vindicated, even though she had not lived to see its resolution. The revelation of Wellington's fate also provided closure for other military families whose relatives had been victims of Japanese intelligence operations during World War II. The recovered documents contained references to numerous other operations, disappearances, and assassination plots that had been carried out against American personnel throughout the Pacific Theater. Military historians recognized that the Wellington case represented just one example of sophisticated intelligence warfare that had been conducted in parallel with conventional military operations during World War II. The complexity and success of Japanese intelligence activities in Hawaii had been largely hidden from public knowledge for decades, partly due to embarrassment about security failures and partly due to ongoing concerns about revealing counterintelligence methods and capabilities. The physical evidence recovered from the underwater cave was eventually displayed at the Pearl Harbor National Memorial, where Wellington's story became part of the historical record about wartime intelligence operations and their human costs. His sacrifice was finally recognized not just as a military casualty, but as a victim of espionage activities that had claimed numerous lives while remaining hidden from historical accounts for decades. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following General Marcus Wellington's story. We'll see you in the next video.